Come along with us as we explore the broad world of preservation and the work being done to preserve, interpret, and save our past in a 21st century world. From aquaculture to historic foodways to forensic modeling, we're talking weekly with experts from across the globe. This is your host, Nick Redding. Welcome to PreserveCast. This is Nick Redding. You're listening to PreserveCast. Excited today to be sitting down with Kathryn Mayer. We're going to be talking with her about a really fascinating project that she's worked on with the Baltimore City Archives and how she has taken a collection of information and turned it into a pretty fascinating database and what we can learn from a database like that and how to evaluate historic information. But before we get there, we love to get to know people and sort of their background, their history. So Kathryn, where did you grow up and what kind of put you on the path to being interested in archival work and history?
Yeah, so I grew up in Pikesville, Maryland, which is not far from Baltimore. It's in the county. And I think, so I definitely growing up was, or at least thought I was not particularly interested in history. I was never really into history classes in school. But I was always very, very interested in the neighborhood that I grew up in and the names and how it came to be. And in particular, there was actually a very old house behind my house that I later ended up researching, but it's kind of like a mansion. It's got like a big field attached to it. And I was always very curious because it was kind of in my backyard. It didn't seem like anyone lived there. And that really was like the first historical research I did on my own, I guess. I ended up learning a lot about Pikesville's history and I think realizing that there was literally history in my backyard and it wasn't just, world wars.
Yeah, not everyone has that, I guess. Not everyone has sort of history in their backyard. So that's a pretty cool experience. And then so from there, this happened before you went to college, I guess. Where'd you go to college and how'd you go down the path of archival work?
Yeah, so I went to University of Maryland, and I actually majored in English. I was still at that point really unsure of what I wanted to pursue. And then about halfway through getting my degree in English, I started taking a couple anthropology classes and realized I really liked that. So I looked into getting a minor in anthropology, and they did not actually offer a minor in anthropology, but they did offer a minor in archaeology. And so I figured that was close enough. And so I decided to minor in archaeology. And I went to field school in Annapolis with archaeology in Annapolis. And it was fascinating. And I realized I loved history and I loved, discovering history and archaeology and everything like that. And so after that experience, it was kind of like, this is something I want to pursue.
So the project, and I guess, did you go on to further education beyond that? Is that sort of where that?
So that was not the end. I actually recently went back to University of Maryland to get my master's degree in library science and archival. So that's not really on the archaeology end, more on the back end, but still very interesting. And I focused on archives and digitization for my master's degree. And part of the degree program was we had to get an internship in the field. And so I actually discovered that the Baltimore City Archives is kind of in my backyard now. And I didn't even know that they were there at the time, but I emailed them and asked if they had an intern opportunity, and they said yes. So that's how I ended up with BCA.
So if Kathryn moves into your neighborhood and you're a historic preservation group in your backyard, you might be in luck. She might end up researching you.
Yeah.
So we connected, and you sort of said, "Oh, I've got this really cool project that we're working on at Baltimore City Archives. Maybe you'd be interested in it." And I mean, it just captured me right away. So these are coroner's reports. So you get there and you start digging into things. How do you stumble upon coroner's reports, and what is a coroner's report?
So, this was actually not my original project. I was supposed to be going through old mayoral records. But when I was interviewing and kind of talking to my supervisor about what I was going to be doing, she happened to ask if I was interested in morbid things. And I said yes. And I've always been very interested in morbid things. And she said, we have kind of a macabre project that we could assign to you. And that is looking through these old coroner reports and interment reports as well, and trying to make a database of all of the people who lived in Baltimore in the 1800s and how they lived and how they died. And the coroner's reports are really fascinating because they're all kind of different. And I've since I started working there, I actually have looked at coroner's reports from different cities and different states. And especially, back in the 1800s, I don't think that there were any like standards of how they had to be. So they're wildly different. I mean, I've seen some that are very detailed that list occupations and, a lot about the people, and others that are kind of just scribbles and have like a first name and no other information. So
And
it's very,
it details, like, people, I guess, probably listening or imagining how people died, where they died,
yes.
and when they died, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
at the most basic, that's kind of what's baked into these, right? I mean, that's maybe give an example of, and we'll talk about some, because I want to dig into some of ones that you found that maybe are interesting and things like that. But what might you actually run across when you're looking at it, or what ends up in this database, which you shared and is pretty cool?
Yeah, so the typical information they have will be the name of the person, the date that they died, or at least the ballpark date that they think they died, because they didn't have, the technology to determine exact time of death. And then a cause of death. And those could ranged from pretty average to pretty wild. There were some very strange ones. And also place of death, and where or where the body was found, and then sometimes where it was buried.
So that gives you really a lot of information. And I think for a lot of people researching in the 19th century, sometimes we feel like you're limited to if somebody wrote information. And so that's a particular type of person who would write something about their life. And then, actually that being saved. And so then sometimes you're limited to like census information, but this paints a different picture. But so much of this information is kind of buried in archives. It hasn't been digitized. So what's the process that you went through? Like, are these reports each one a page, or is it more like a census document where you're just finding sort of these lines, like they just did one after the other? What does an actual document look like that you're pulling for this?
So these are all individual papers, individual documents. There are many, many boxes of them, and I am still nowhere near finished. But basically, it's kind of like they have a template sort of where they have like a space for the name and the date and the cause of death. Most of them are handwritten by the coroner. And so sometimes they can be a little difficult to read. And a few of them are a bit eroded. They're not all perfectly preserved. But yeah, they are all individual documents.
And what's the scale of what we're talking about here? So you said the 19th century, which is 100 years by definition.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense for how long they go? And like, I mean, obviously there's coroner's reports today. They're probably very different, and probably, I imagine, actually just digital now. But what is what's the potential scale of this project? Understanding you may not be able to complete it all, but like how much are we talking about?
So, I have been focusing primarily on the mid 1800s. I could theoretically, do the whole 1800s, but I mean, even in the mid 1800s, there were a lot of people and a lot of them died. And so it is quite large. So I have gotten from, let's see, I think I started in 1820 and I am at 1839.
So, and that's enough that from where I'm headed with this is that's enough that you're actually able to start drawing like conclusions. I mean, it's somewhat,
Right.
I mean, you
Yeah.
can start pulling trends from this, I would imagine,
Mhm.
and you can see, is it possible within the records and the way you've organized, at least the way you shared it with me, you have Excel. I don't know if it's, or if that's just how you outputted it, but um, you can start drawing conclusions and trends. I would imagine, like if there's a yellow fever epidemic or things like that, that would show up and almost be something that you could query the database and see. Is that potentially possible?
Yeah, actually, I've found some very interesting patterns. We, I actually this winter discovered a very, very strange pattern that I haven't fully researched, but I would like to. There was, I believe it was in 1836, um, in December, there were a ton of deaths that happened right outside of the medical hospital, or I'm sorry, the teaching hospital, I think they called it. Um, and uh and they were all different ages, all different races, genders. It was very strange, and I'm not sure what happened there. So there are all kinds of like weird little patterns that arise. And then also another interesting thing is I think that I haven't just learned about like the people who died, but also about the coroners themselves, because um, in that span of time, there were multiple coroners that were making these reports. And it got to a point where I could kind of tell which coroner wrote which report because some of them were a lot more detailed than others. And they usually signed them too, so I could tell from their name. But it was really interesting because the level of detail change and just the fastidiousness, I guess, of the reports varied a
Yeah.
lot.
And probably their handwriting too varied a
Yes, and
little
their
bit.
handwriting, definitely.
So, and I guess in some ways, kind of going back to a further or earlier sort of topic here is so few people from the 19th century of sort of middle and lower economic classes left written documentation about their lives. I mean, they might pop up in a census, but beyond that, they may not. And this, in some ways, in an odd way, it almost like humanizes them. Like it kind of paints a picture of their final moments there, what happened to them at the end. Um, have does it feel that way? Like you're kind of, and have you researched anyone further who you found that passed away?
Yes, a little bit. And I think that is a really interesting aspect of it because there is often very little detail in these reports, but sometimes it's just enough that you can kind of get an idea of who these people were. And there were people who, for instance, someone who was found down by the marina and was drowned. Drowning was a very common cause of death back in the 1800s. And a lot of those people were working on the docks and in the marinas. And then you could see where they were buried, and a lot of the lower economic class people were buried in Pottersfield Cemetery. So if you had someone who drowned by the harbor and was buried in East Pottersfield, you can kind of glean that that was probably someone from a lower socioeconomic class. And then, I mean, there were all other kinds of things, like you could potentially find people from the same family. I found a very interesting father and son who were both apparently struck by lightning on different days. So I'm not
What?
sure what happened there. Yeah. Yeah, there was some really fascinating stuff. And you know, it's like very difficult to research some of this because they didn't have particularly distinguished names. So I just kind of had to read that and let it sit there. um,
And I feel like all of this could be this rich source material for somebody to follow. I mean, that, the archivist kind of sets the canvas out, and then other people can follow. I mean, for years, people will be using this information. How are people going to be able to access this information? Is it eventually going to be publicly accessible, this database that's being created?
Yeah, our main goal is to make it publicly accessible because a lot of the people who come into the archives are doing genealogical research. And right now I mean, we have tons and tons of records, but especially older records are handwritten and it's much more difficult to make them searchable. And so by making this database, we're trying to make it easier for people to search their last name, or if they know the name of a distant relative, to be able to just put in their name and find them.
And how soon, what's the timeline on that? Because I'm sure people listening, particularly people who have Baltimore genealogy, are sort of itching to find out if their ancestors buried in here, so to
Yeah.
speak.
I wish I had a concrete answer because I'm not entirely sure when it's going to be publicly available. Hopefully soon. And hopefully we can make it available before it's completely finished, because I really don't know when it's going to be completely finished. It is a lot of information. But we already
Yeah.
have quite a bit, so hopefully very soon.
Yeah, and the part that Kathryn shared with me in advance of the conversation was really, I mean, I spent an inordinate amount of time just kind of scrolling through it and looking at all these. Was there, I mean, you said that apparently you answered to your supervisor that, yes, you're interested in morbid things. So for those listening who want some of the morbid, what's the strangest cause of death that you feel like you came across, or maybe any of, or a collection, if there's several that popped out that you were like, oh wow?
Yeah, let's see. So definitely one of the, if not the strangest cause of death I came across, was that someone was listed as having died from eating crabs and cabbage. And I'm not sure if it was the combination of the
Yeah, is
two.
it the combination? Is there something we should be concerned about, Kathryn?
um, yeah, and there were actually, that was probably the strangest, but there were a few people who supposedly died from eating different things that are not poisonous. They're just, I'm not sure if they ate too much of it or what happened there, but um, another very common thing, which I did do some research on, was a lot of people were listed as having died from drinking cold water. And apparently, they think that refers to heat stroke, because they didn't fully understand it. But basically, when someone got heat stroke, they would drink cold water. And I guess somewhere along the line, they decided that it was the drinking cold water that killed them rather than the heat stroke. um, yeah, so that was really interesting. Um, Another really common cause of death, interestingly, was visitations from God, which was basically if they couldn't determine someone's cause of death, and presumably it would be like a health issue that would cause them to like drop dead, they would just write that it was a visitation of God. So there are all these records that are like died from visitation of God on Pratt Street, and it's like, okay, he was there, I guess.
Yeah, that would be a good name for a book if you write one about
Yeah,
this.
yeah, it would be a really good
Yeah.
name.
So, I guess also question, obviously Baltimore has a huge African American population. And sometimes records are segregated in that time period. What is the story with black death in these coroner's reports? Do they show up? What about enslaved? How does that all play out in the records?
So it's very interesting because I think around the time period that I am looking at, there were some who were enslaved and others who were free. It's not always noted on the coroner's report, but it is almost always noted if they were Black, um, just not always whether they were enslaved. But it is very interesting to see. A lot of the time, unfortunately, those are the records that contain not a lot of detail, which is sad to see, but not super surprising. Um, and a lot of times I can only even tell that a person might have been Black based on where they were buried. There were a lot of specifically Black cemeteries, Bethel churches, AME. Um, and yeah, it is definitely, there's definitely a divide between how much detail is provided for presumably like upper class whites too, would have had more detail available. Sometimes, I mean, I've seen even coroner's reports where they don't even have a name. It's just, slave of the slave owner, which is very sad and also very difficult to research because you don't even have a name.
So Baltimore is also home to a lot of other ethnicities and different populations and backgrounds. Do they call out that, or is it like, would you see, because I mean we have a large Jewish population, there were Native Americans living in Baltimore, there were all sorts of, do you see those pop out as well, or do they not get into that level of detail?
Interestingly, they don't really get into that level of detail because I was also very curious about that. I know I personally have like some Jewish ancestors in Baltimore, and yeah, they really all I've really seen is like Black, white. Sometimes they'll list if someone was like from a foreign country, they'll say like this was a German person. But I have not seen any other kind of racial indicators.
Interesting. And the other question I have too is, as the 19th century goes on, obviously photography becomes more widespread. It becomes cheaper. It becomes something, you see this in different types of records where as the 19th century moves on, you start seeing the addition of photography to this. In the later records, is that part of it? Or when does photography, because now I would imagine that if there's a crime scene or something like that, and I'm sure crimes are picked up in this as well, that they would photograph that. When did that come in? Do you have any idea when you'll start seeing that?
I don't actually know when I'll start seeing that. I have not started seeing it yet. Yeah, right now it is all written.
And what about crimes? How do crimes like play out in it? Are there ever do you ever find more information, like a sketch of how somebody was found, or any of that detail, or anything associated with crime, or is that a completely different record? Does that then go to the police department?
Yeah, so there are a lot of records about crimes that were committed that led to deaths, murders, etc. Um, and a lot of times they would just be kind of the description would just be killed by Bobby Smith or whoever. Um, and they would just leave it at that. So it was always very interesting, and that left a lot of questions on my end. And um, and yeah, I am hoping and assuming that there are more records of these incidents. I believe there were a couple that I actually did try to do a little bit more research on, but a lot of those were difficult to find because a lot of things still aren't digitized from that era.
Yeah, did this work inspire any other research? Did you go digging on anyone else?
Yeah. So Yeah, there were a couple people that I couldn't just let them go because I was so curious. One that stood out was this actually seemed kind of funny in the report, but it ended up just being sad. But his cause of death was listed as a sandbank collapsed on him while he was doing his digging dance. And uh, I shared it with everyone in the archives, and we all were like, "What is a digging dance? What is going on?" And so we did a lot of looking around the archives trying to find anything about this man. And we did find actually a newspaper report about this big sand embankment collapse, and he was listed as one of the casualties. Um, and it was very humanizing to read, I think, because I mean, there's so little detail in some of these reports that stuff like this can kind of sound silly, but like he had a whole family, and we got to kind of learn more about like his surviving relatives. And um, unfortunately, they did not say anything about the digging dance, so we never figured out what that was. But yeah, there were a couple people we were able to find a little bit more information about.
Yeah. And any notable Baltimoreans pop up in the list? Anyone like, hey, I've heard that name?
Um, Interestingly, so no, we I did actually find a John Waters, not the John. I mean, obviously he's still alive. There was a John Waters in the 1800s who also lived in Baltimore, so that was interesting. And I am getting very close to 1840, and I know that's when Edgar Allan Poe died. So I've been on the lookout for his name, but I have not found it yet.
That'll be we'll have to have you back or at least share it out once it is available. I know that that's coming. And that'll be exciting. What's the next project that you're working on or hope to work on, or are you just going to stay focused on this for the time being?
I am still focusing on this, but I have actually also been doing a little bit of freelance genealogy research. Recently, we had a man from North Carolina who had a request for research and didn't really want to come into the Baltimore archives because it's far away, but he traces ancestors here. So I got to do a little bit of that, and that was actually very, very interesting. It was a lot more like in-depth, like particular people research. And so a lot of what I do for the database is kind of just skimming the surface, and this was definitely digging deeper. So, I mean, I would love in the future to get to dig deeper on some of these people. That would be really, really interesting.
And before we go, we love to ask people what their favorite historic place or site is. What is yours?
Yeah, so I think all of the places I went to in field school were amazing. I think the one that stands out the most is the Y Island Orangery. It is the oldest remaining greenhouse in America. And it is just a beautiful place. Very, very interesting. There's when we got to go inside it and we got to see graffiti on the walls, not like modern graffiti, but like people had literally like scrawled things on the walls, and it was just one of those places where you can just like feel the history, and it was really interesting.
Well, that's a great and a fascinating answer. PreserveCast, as many people know, is powered by Preservation Maryland, and Preservation Maryland actually holds an easement on that structure, and so a protective easement to make sure it stays in place. So that's the first time we've had an answer like that on PreserveCast, which is pretty cool. So All came full circle. Well, this is fascinating. I want to make sure that people know who are listening to this. Whenever the Baltimore City Archives gets a portion of this up, we'll be sure to share it because I know people are going to want to dig through this and learn more. And you can go and find out more about what the Baltimore City Archives already has on digitized and available by going to their website as well. And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. So, Kathryn, thanks so much for joining us today. This is just so fascinating and love the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to PreserveCast. To dig deeper into this episode's story, head over to PreserveCast.org for show notes and our collection of previous episodes. Don't forget to engage with this podcast by subscribing, commenting, and leaving a review. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at PreserveCast for even more. PreserveCast is currently recorded in Walkersville, Maryland, and sponsored by the 1772 Foundation, and powered by Preservation Maryland. Thanks for listening, and keep on preserving.